I was 33 when I took a solo camping trip in northern Idaho in the summer of 2017. I'd been working construction jobs for over a decade, most of them in hot cities, and I was burned out. I needed a break from the concrete, noise, and people, and I needed to be alone. Not in a cabin, not in a motel, but out in nature where I wouldn't have to hear car horns or phones buzzing. Just the sound of wind in the trees and maybe the crunch of dry grass under my boots. I chose a place called Dry Creek Ridge. It wasn't a tourist spot, not even marked on most online camping guides. I found it on an old hiking forum where some guy had posted about it 10 years ago. It was hard to find on the map, which was what I liked. It felt like a place I could disappear into for a while. I packed light but carefully. One-person tent, a small axe, a decent hunting knife, 2 water filters, 6 freeze-dried meals, oatmeal packs, jerky, a first aid kit, a compass, matches, a headlamp, a flashlight, backup batteries, a solar charger, bear spray, and a .357 I kept for bears or whatever else I might run into. I'd hunted before, and while I wasn't afraid of the woods, I also didn't trust that being prepared always saved you. Nature doesn't care how ready you are. I left Boise early on a Thursday morning and reached the closest pull-off road to the trail around noon. It was just gravel and overgrown brush, no signs, no cell signal. I locked the truck, slung on my pack, and started walking east through the pines. The trail wasn't really a trail. It was more like a fading deer path that disappeared sometimes and reappeared 100 yards later. I kept the sun over my right shoulder to stay on track and hiked for hours. The land was dry and steep in places, but there were thick sections of trees with enough shade to cool off in. I drank often, stopped a few times to rest, and by evening I found a spot near a dry creek bed with enough flat ground to set up camp. I pitched the tent under a cluster of pine trees, gathered some dry wood, and lit a small fire. The air was cool, pine-scented, and clean. It felt good to be that far from anyone, just listening to the forest settle. I ate jerky, sipped water, and lay down in the tent as it got dark. I remember hearing a few coyotes in the distance. That was normal. The first night was peaceful, nothing out of place. I woke up early, packed up, and kept heading deeper into the woods. I didn't have a specific destination in mind. I just wanted to move further from roads, from people, from anything artificial. The higher I climbed, the quieter it got. By midday, I hadn't seen a single soul.
No footprints, no trash.
Nothing, but something small changed that second afternoon. I found a tin can. It was half buried in dirt about a foot off the trail, rusted, the label long gone. It looked old, maybe 10, 20 years, maybe more. I thought nothing of it at first, but 30 minutes later, I spotted a strip of blue tarp snagged in a bush, then a piece of rope nailed into a tree. These weren't ancient, maybe a few years old at most. I started thinking someone else might be living out here, some off-grid hermit or survivalist, maybe just another camper who forgot his gear. Still, it didn't sit right. I wasn't near any known campsite. This place was way too remote for casual hikers. That night, I camped near a ridge that overlooked a long, empty stretch of forest. No towns, no cabins, just endless trees. I set up near a rock outcropping, made a small fire again, and tried to enjoy the evening. But I kept looking out into the woods, like I expected to see someone standing out there. I didn't. I turned in early, figuring I was just letting my imagination mess with me. But I woke up just after midnight. I didn't know why at first. There wasn't a sound. No snapping branches, no animals moving. Just dead silence. And it wasn't the kind of peaceful silence you get in the mountains. It was heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it. A soft crunch, like someone stepping lightly on dry pine needles. It came from about 20 feet to the right of the tent. Then again, another step, then silence. I grabbed the revolver from my pack, held my breath, and waited. My heart thumped so hard I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. After maybe 5 minutes of nothing, I unzipped the tent slowly and peeked out. The moon was full and bright enough to see, but there was nothing there. No person, no animal. I stayed up until dawn, staring into the trees. By morning, I convinced myself it could have been a deer or a coyote, maybe even a bear. They move quiet sometimes. Still, I packed up fast and kept hiking, heading further east, toward a small lake marked on my printed topo map. It was supposed to be in a small basin about 8 miles away. As I walked, I noticed something else.
Footprints.
Just faint indentations, barely visible in the hard dirt. But they were there. They weren't mine, too small. I wear size 12 boots. These were maybe size 9 or 10. And they were fresh. Maybe a day old, maybe less. I followed them for half a mile before they veered off into thicker brush and vanished. By the time I reached the lake, I was exhausted. I wanted to go home. I knew I should have turned around, but I was already 3 days in and didn't want to hike 8 hours back in one push. The lake was small and surrounded by trees and rock walls. It looked untouched, but there were signs it wasn't. Near the edge of the lake, half hidden behind a log, was a small tarp shelter. Blue plastic, faded and torn at the corners. It looked old, but someone had been using it recently. I saw a fire ring, a few cans, and a plastic bottle with cloudy water inside. No one was around, but I didn't like it. I didn't want to camp that close to someone else's setup. So I moved a 1/4 mile uphill and found a ledge with a view of the basin. I could see the lake, the trees, the sky, and if someone returned to the tarp, I'd see them before they saw me. That night was worse. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up again. This time I knew what I heard. Footsteps, clear as day, slow, deliberate, walking up the hill toward me. No animal walks like that. Not a deer, not a bear. This was someone on 2 feet. I didn't move. I had the gun beside me, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped maybe 30 feet away. Then nothing. I waited. No sound.
No breathing. No branches snapping.
Just stillness. After half an hour, I cracked the tent flap and looked out. Again, no one. But there was something new. On a flat rock near the edge of the ledge, just 20 feet from my tent, was a dead rabbit. Its neck was broken, clean, no blood, no signs of a predator, just placed there, like a gift or a warning. I didn't sleep after that. At dawn, I packed up and left fast. I didn't eat, didn't filter water, just walked. I wasn't following a trail anymore. I just used the sun and my compass to push west. I wanted out. I didn't care how long it took. But the woods didn't make it easy. I walked for hours and never found the old trail again. Everything started looking the same. Pine trees, dry creek beds, rocky hills. I kept a steady pace, checked the compass every 20 minutes, and still felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. Around mid-afternoon, I heard something that made my stomach turn. Chopping, the distant, rhythmic thunk of an axe hitting wood. Not close, but not far either. Maybe half a mile north. I froze and listened. It went on for about a minute, then stopped. That was enough for me. I turned sharply south and started moving faster, practically jogging down a slope, ignoring the scratches from thorns and branches. I didn't want to meet whoever was out there swinging that axe. The dead rabbit, the tarp, the footsteps. None of it felt right. I made it 5 more miles before I found a stretch of rock with a clear view of the valley below. And for the first time in 3 days, I saw something familiar, an old logging road. It was probably a mile away, but I could reach it before dark if I moved. I slid down the hill, cut across the basin, and hit the road by evening. I followed it west for hours until I found my truck just as the sun was going down. It was still there, untouched, but something was sitting on the hood. A rock, Just a plain, round rock about the size of a baseball. It wasn't there when I left. I didn't hesitate. I unlocked the truck, threw my gear in, and drove. I didn't stop for food. I didn't stop for gas. I drove all the way back to Boise, only pulling over once when I felt like I might fall asleep at the wheel. When I got home, I unloaded my gear and checked the tent. There were marks on the rainfly. Not scratches, not tears, marks. Like someone had pressed a hand against it with dirty fingers. For long smears, like someone had been leaning on it. I never went back to Dry Creek Ridge. I told myself I'd imagined most of it. That maybe someone else had just been living rough out there, off the grid, and I'd stumbled too close. But the dead rabbit, the footsteps, the rock on my hood, I couldn't explain those. I still camp, but only in places with cell service within a mile of other people. Places with trailheads and ranger stations and signs. I learned something out there. It isn't always the wild animals you have to worry about. It's the people who choose to live where no one can find them and don't want to be found. It was mid-September 2019. I was 34 then, single, no kids, and had taken a week off work to get away from the noise and stress of the city. I lived in Bend, Oregon, and had been doing remote IT work for the past 3 years. The pressure from deadlines and clients had started to pile up, and I felt myself slipping into that sort of mental exhaustion you can't fix with a few nights of sleep. I needed quiet. I needed space. So I packed up my older Toyota Tacoma, loaded my dog in the passenger seat, and drove east into the desert. My dog's name is Cody, a 6-year-old yellow lab. Strong, smart, always full of energy. I trusted him more than I trusted most people. I'd taken him hiking, fishing, camping. He was my closest companion. Never had a problem with him. If anything, I felt safer with him than being alone. I planned to spend 4 nights camping in the high desert about 2 hours east of Burns, Oregon. Not a lot of people go that far out. The area isn't managed like a national park. It's just empty scrubland and jagged basalt cliffs, scattered trees and rough dirt trails used mostly by ranchers or hunters. The kind of place where no one would bother you, but also the kind of place where if something went wrong, there might not be anyone around to help. I didn't mind that. I brought plenty of supplies, water, food, backup batteries, emergency gear. I had paper maps, GPS. I'd done stuff like this before, though maybe not quite this far out. The drive was quiet. Cody leaned against the window most of the way, nose twitching. We passed through burns, then smaller roads, then no roads at all, just dusty tracks etched into the pale earth. By late afternoon, I found a flat clearing surrounded by low hills and some thin trees that offered a bit of shade. There were no signs of other campers, no tire tracks. Felt untouched, wild, peaceful. I parked the truck, stretched my legs, and let Cody out to explore. He trotted off, sniffing bushes and rocks, tail wagging. I set up my tent about 20 yards from the truck and laid out a small cooking area with my portable stove and supplies. The ground was hard and dry, sand and gravel mostly. Sharp-edged rocks poked through in places. I had to clear some debris to get the tent staked in properly. That first night was uneventful. We ate some freeze-dried food, watched the sunset behind the hills. The sky turned a deep orange, then purple, then black. The stars were unbelievable out there. With no towns nearby, the sky was full of light. Cody curled up beside me near the fire pit as I drank some tea and just listened. Nothing, not even wind, just total silence. I slept well that night. The air got cold, but I had a good sleeping bag. Cody snored a bit. I felt completely alone in a good way. The second day, we hiked one of the ridgelines. I had marked a few places I wanted to check out, rock formations, dry creek beds. It was hot during the day, cold at night. Classic high desert. We walked for hours, didn't see a soul. Cody chased a rabbit for a while but came back with his tongue hanging out and his tail high. Later that afternoon, after we returned to camp, I noticed something strange. About 50 yards from the tent, just beyond where the trees thinned out, I saw tire tracks in the dirt. Not fresh, but not completely old either. The kind of faint imprint you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. Wide treads. Looked like a pickup or a 4x4 had driven through there recently. Caught my attention because I hadn't seen any sign of other people. No litter, no noise, no movement. It was odd that someone else had been out here, and I hadn't noticed. I walked the tracks for a bit. They went down into a wash and curved behind a hill, then disappeared. Looked like whoever it was had turned around and left. I didn't think much of it at the time. Figured maybe it was a rancher checking fence lines or some hunters passing through. But that night, I started to feel different. Cody was restless after dark. Normally he sleeps right through the night, but this time he kept lifting his head, ears perked, listening to something I couldn't hear. A couple of times he growled low in his throat, barely audible. I stepped outside the tent with my flashlight, scanned the trees, saw nothing, no movement, no sound, but the feeling in my chest, tight, heavy. Cody stayed close that night, real close. He lay pressed against the flap of the tent, like he wanted to be the first thing between me and anything outside. By the third day, I felt a little unsettled, but I didn't want to cut the trip short. I pushed the thought aside and did what I came to do. Hiked some more, took photos, tried to let the quiet heal me. But then something happened that I still can't explain. That afternoon, I came back to camp and found a boot print in the dirt. One, just one, maybe 10 feet from my tent. The wind hadn't been strong that day. There was no way I missed it earlier. It wasn't mine. Wrong tread, too big. Cody started barking when we got back. Not just alert barking, angry. Hackles up, full voice. He ran toward the tree line and stayed there, ears pointed, body tense. I shouted for him and he came back, but he didn't relax for hours. Kept pacing in a wide circle around camp, sniffing the air, looking in every direction. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going longer than usual, sitting with my flashlight in one hand and a heavy-duty knife in the other. Cody didn't sleep either. He stayed awake, head always turning, eyes scanning the dark. The wind picked up a bit, and every rustle made my chest jump. I thought about leaving, but I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe it was just a random hiker or camper who had passed through earlier and I hadn't noticed. Maybe the print had been there all along. But I knew that wasn't true. The fourth morning, I found something else. Near the edge of camp, there was a dead rabbit, gutted, slit clean down the middle, not chewed up like an animal would do it. No blood trail, just lying there, belly open like it had been placed there. Cody didn't go near it. I packed everything. Fast. No breakfast, no fire. I crammed the tent into the truck bed. Didn't even roll it up properly. Just stuffed it. My hands were shaking. Cody jumped into the cab without me saying anything. We drove out fast, bouncing along the dirt path until we hit a wider gravel road. I didn't stop. My heart was pounding like a drum. I didn't feel safe until we reached the paved highway back near Burns, and even then, it didn't fully stop. When I got home, I kept replaying everything. The boot print, the gutted rabbit, Cody's behavior, the truck tracks. None of it added up to something specific. It wasn't like I saw someone. It wasn't like I heard threats, but it felt targeted. Weeks passed, and I still couldn't sleep well. I looked at satellite maps, trying to see if there were ranches or anything nearby. I couldn't find any structures in that area. I told a friend who used to work in search and rescue about it. He just nodded and said people sometimes live off-grid out there. Squatters, loners, guys who don't want to be found. He said some of them don't like company. He told me a story about a man who went missing near Steens Mountain in the 90s. They found his car but never found him. That didn't help. I haven't been back to that area since. I still camp, still hike, but not that deep into the desert. Not alone, and not without service. Sometimes I still think about the way that Rabbit was laid out. Too clean, like a message. Cody's older now. He doesn't move as fast, but he still perks up when he hears something outside. I trust him more than ever. I never saw who was out there with us, but someone was, and I don't think they wanted us to leave. I think they wanted us to stay, and that's why I left. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo camping trip across France. I had just turned 26, and I was working a job in Paris that left me burnt out and tired of city life. I needed a break, somewhere quiet, away from people, phones, traffic, emails, and everything else that had been eating away at my mind for the past year. My name's Matthew, and back then I thought I could handle anything. I really did, but this one trip changed the way I see the world. I chose a small forested area near a village called Mouth in eastern France, close to the Swiss border. It wasn't a famous tourist destination, which is what I wanted. I looked it up online, and there were a few old posts on hiking forums about it. Nothing creepy or mysterious, just people saying the trails were decent and it stayed quiet even in the summer. Perfect. I rented a small car and drove out on a Tuesday morning with a rucksack, a tent, some food, a little gas stove, water, a few changes of clothes, a first aid kit, and my sleeping bag. I brought a knife too, nothing fancy, just a basic camping knife I'd had for years. Took about 6 hours to get there. The last stretch of the road narrowed into a gravel track, and when I reached the end, I parked in a dirt clearing where a wooden sign pointed to a hiking trail. No one else was around. There were tire marks in the dirt, but they looked old and faded. The air was cool and fresh, and I could hear birds echoing through the trees. Felt right. I hiked about 40 minutes into the woods before I found a small flat area near a dry stream bed. I set up my tent there, rolled out my mat, and made a small fire pit with some stones. It was mid-afternoon by the time I finished. I boiled some water, made instant noodles, and sat there in silence, watching the trees sway above me. The forest was thick, mostly pine, but the underbrush wasn't too dense, so I could see a good distance in most directions. I didn't feel nervous. Not yet. That first night was quiet. I read a book on my Kindle for a while and went to sleep early. I didn't even need earplugs. The only sounds were owls and the wind moving through the branches. I felt completely alone, and for the first time in a while, I liked it. No stress, no noise, just me and the woods. The second day, I woke up around 7 a.m. and made coffee with my gas burner. It was chilly, probably around 10 degrees Celsius. I wandered a bit with my map, followed a trail deeper into the woods, and came across a tiny abandoned stone building that looked like it had once been a shepherd's hut. I took a few pictures, sat on a rock, and ate some trail mix. That afternoon, something strange happened. I was walking back toward my campsite from the stream when I saw movement between the trees ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it wasn't. It was a man, tall, thin, and wearing a dark coat even though it was warm. He wasn't carrying a bag or hiking gear. He was just standing there, half turned away, maybe 50 meters from me. His posture was stiff and he didn't seem to notice me. I stopped walking and watched him for a moment. Then, without turning his head, he stepped behind a tree and disappeared from view. I waited. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement. I called out a loud bonjour, even though I had told myself I wouldn't talk to anyone. Still nothing. I waited another minute, then moved forward cautiously. But when I got to where he had been, there was no one. No tracks, no footprints in the soft dirt. I walked in circles, trying to see if he had gone in another direction, but it was like he had just vanished. I chalked it up to maybe seeing someone from the village hunting or mushroom picking. Still, it didn't sit right with me. His stillness, his clothes, the way he didn't react to me. I didn't mention it in my travel journal that night because I didn't want to admit it bothered me. But it did. That night, I had a hard time sleeping. I kept waking up, convinced I'd heard twigs snapping outside. At one point around 2 a.m., I thought I saw a light flash briefly through the trees. I lay in my sleeping bag, my hand gripping the knife beside me, waiting. I told myself it was nothing, probably just my imagination messing with me. By the third day, I felt off. I was still alone. Hadn't seen or heard anyone else since I arrived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't explore much that day. I stayed close to my camp, read, and cooked a little more food. Every now and then, I'd glance up because I thought I heard movement, but there was never anything there. That evening, while I was boiling water, I found something odd. A small twig figure, maybe 10 centimeters tall, leaning against a rock near the edge of my camp. It looked like someone had tied it together with bits of dried grass and string. I hadn't seen it before. It hadn't been there the night before, I was sure of that. I stared at it for a long time. My first thought was that maybe someone else was camping nearby and decided to mess with me. But I hadn't seen a single soul since I parked my car. Not one person. No voices. No fires in the distance. Nothing. I tossed the figure into the fire. That night, the forest felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was tight, like something was holding its breath. Every little sound made me flinch. I stayed awake most of the night. Around 4 a.m., just before dawn, I finally drifted off. I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the side of my tent. It was light. Not claws, not a paw, more like fingers. I stayed frozen. I couldn't hear breathing or footsteps, but something was moving very slowly along the outer fabric of the tent. I reached for my knife again and just waited. After about 20 seconds, the sound stopped. I waited another 10 minutes before I worked up the nerve to unzip the tent and look outside. There was nothing. No prints. No broken twigs. Just morning light and cold air. But then I saw something further back, near the trees. A small pile of stones that hadn't been there before. 6 smooth rocks stacked in a tower, about knee height, like a marker. I walked up to it slowly. One of the stones had a smear of something dark on it. I thought maybe mud, but it looked like blood. That was the moment I decided I was leaving. I packed my stuff in a rush. Took less than 30 minutes. I didn't even make coffee. I just shoved everything into my bag, kicked out the fire pit, and started walking fast toward where I had parked. I checked over my shoulder constantly. The woods were still silent, but it didn't feel like I was alone. The hike back felt longer than it should have. I was sweating and stumbling over roots, and every few minutes I thought I heard someone behind me, just a step or two. But when I turned, there was no one. When I finally reached the clearing where I had left my car, I froze. The back hatch was open. I hadn't left it that way. I was 100% sure I had locked the whole car when I left it 3 days ago. Nothing was missing, but the inside had been disturbed. My spare clothes had been pulled out, and there were muddy smears on the floor. I closed it fast, jumped in, and started the engine. The drive out of the forest was nerve-wracking. Every turn, I expected someone to step out of the trees or block the road, but no one came. When I finally hit paved road again and passed the first farmhouse, I breathed like I hadn't in days. I didn't go back to Paris right away. I stopped at a small hotel in Pontarlier and spent the night there. I didn't sleep well. I kept checking the door and window. I was still trying to process everything. Was it just some local screwing with me? Or was it worse than that? The next day, I called the local gendarmerie, the rural police, and told them someone had messed with my car while it was parked near mouth. I didn't tell them everything, just that someone had opened the trunk and that maybe they should check the area. The officer on the phone sounded bored, said maybe it was kids or a poacher. I didn't push it. I flew back to the UK a week later. I didn't tell anyone what really happened, not even my parents. I still have the photos I took on that trip, including one of the abandoned shepherd's hut. But I don't look at them much anymore. Something was wrong in those woods. I don't know if it was one man or more. I don't know why he watched me or touched my tent or left those markers. But I do know this. If I hadn't packed up when I did, if I had stayed one more night, I might not have made it out. There was no ghost, no monster, just someone real, quiet, and careful who was watching. I haven't been camping alone since, and I never will again. I wasn't supposed to be there that weekend. Rain Creek Campground was one of those half-forgotten places deep in the Ozark National Forest. Not many people bothered with it anymore since the access road got damaged a few years back. The park rangers had stopped maintaining it regularly, and there were no marked trails left. Most of the campsites were rough patches of grass with faded metal fire rings, the kind that looked like they hadn't held a proper fire in years. That was exactly why I chose it. Life had gotten heavy. I worked a lot, never really saw anyone anymore, and my apartment in Little Rock felt like a trap. The kind you set for yourself without realizing it. For walls, the same blinking router light, the microwave spinning leftovers in the dark. I needed to get out. I needed silence and trees, maybe some cold air and mud on my boots to shake something loose. So I packed my gear late on a Friday night: tent, stove, knife, first aid kit, dry food, tarp, extra socks, and drove up the winding roads early Saturday morning. By 11 a.m., I was bouncing down the rocky path leading to Rain Creek. My old truck groaned, tires slipping a little in the loose gravel, but it made it. I parked just beyond a small wooden sign that said, Site 3 to 0.4 miles. There were no other cars. I loaded up my pack and started walking. The leaves were mostly down, wet from a drizzle the night before. The path was narrow and uneven, scattered with old branches. The air smelled like damp bark and soil. No phone service. No noises except for wind through the trees and the squish of my boots. By the time I got to Site 3, the clouds had thickened. It was a decent clearing, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by a semicircle of tall pines. You could see a narrow stretch of the creek if you walked to the edge of the slope. I set my tent near the tree lean, strung a tarp overhead, and set up a dry zone for cooking. I used a few downed limbs to build a seat and gathered some firewood, though everything was damp. The first few hours were peaceful. I ate a protein bar, read half a chapter of an old paperback, and sat quietly, watching the trees sway. That kind of silence feels heavy at first, but then it settles into you. I was starting to feel something like relief. Then the rain started. First it was soft, just a whisper on the tarp. But within an hour, it turned heavy. Thick drops pounding on the nylon, streaming down the sides of my tent, soaking the forest. The light faded quickly, earlier than usual. It was only 4:30, but it felt like dusk. I pulled on my rain jacket, zipped the tent closed behind me, and boiled water under the tarp for a freeze-dried meal. I ate standing up, watching the tree line. My firewood was useless now, soaked to the core. The cold crept in fast. By 6, it was pitch black. I crawled into the tent, peeled off the wet layers, and climbed into my sleeping bag. I checked my phone, still no service. I stared at the ceiling of the tent for a while, listening to the rain drum harder and harder. That's when I heard it. A single hard crack, like a branch breaking, not a small one. I sat up, It had come from uphill beyond the campsite, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. I waited, heart beating a little faster. Rain can play tricks, I told myself. Wind knocks things loose. Trees shed limbs. But then I heard footsteps. Heavy, slow ones. Wet leaves underfoot. Not an animal. Not a deer. Not in that pattern. 3 steps. Then nothing. Then 2 more. I turned off my headlamp and sat perfectly still. For 5 minutes, there was only rain. I leaned slightly to the side and pulled my knife from my boot. My breathing had slowed. I waited. Nothing. Then a sharper noise, a sloshing scrape, like something sliding across wet ground. It sounded close, just beyond the tarp. Maybe 10 feet. I didn't move. My hand gripped the knife tighter. My mind flipped through possibilities. A bear? A lost hiker? A hunter? But no one camped here. No one came here. 10 minutes passed. The rain got worse. Winds picked up. The trees groaned and hissed. I didn't hear anything else. By 8 p.m., I figured maybe it was nothing. Maybe just wind and my mind filling in gaps. I lay back down, tried to sleep. I must have drifted in and out for about an hour before I felt it. The tent wall flexed, like something pressed into it from the outside. Not a full push, just enough to cave the fabric inward for a second. I froze, eyes wide open, the knife still in my hand. It happened again just to the left of my feet, then again closer to my chest. Something was testing the tension of the tent. My heart thudded loud in my ears. My mouth was dry. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then silence. For 15 minutes, nothing happened. Then all at once, a hard slap hit the tent near my head. Not a branch, not rain. It was a palm. I knew it. Someone was outside, right there, standing in the storm, touching my tent. I didn't breathe. Another press, this time directly behind me, pushed the nylon inward hard enough to brush my sleeping bag. I snapped. I unzipped the tent in one violent motion, burst out barefoot with the knife in hand, and spun in the dark. Nothing. My headlamp clicked on. Light cut through rain and fog. Nothing but trees. No tracks. No person. But then I saw it. A boot print, half sunken in the mud just outside my tarp line. Deep tread. Not mine. I scanned everything behind trees, down the trail, up the slope. Nothing. I stood there for a long time, rain soaking my shirt, my hair plastered to my face, knife clenched tight. I didn't call out, didn't shout, just listened. After a while, I backed into the tent and zipped it shut. I pulled my boots inside. I didn't sleep at all. The rain didn't stop. By morning, the forest was fogged over, and everything was slick with mud. I packed quickly. The air felt wrong, like something watched from a distance. I didn't even eat, just broke camp and hiked back with one hand on my knife the whole time. The trail was quiet, but I kept seeing boot prints. Always one, like someone had walked up to my camp, then left after I saw the one near the tarp. But the spacing was odd, too wide, too erratic. One here, then nothing for 10 feet. Then another. They weren't fresh either, which made no sense with the rain. By the time I reached my truck, I was soaked and shaking. I threw everything in the bed, jumped in the cab, and turned the key. It wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Panic. The third time, the engine turned over barely, and I gunned it down the gravel, mud spraying the sides. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I never went back to Rain Creek. I looked it up a week later, found a forum post from 2 years ago. A guy saying he'd camped there, heard things at night. Then someone else replied with a vague warning about old hunting shacks in that part of the woods and people who don't want to be found. No one ever mentioned it again. I still don't know who was out there that night. Maybe it was just someone passing through, but I can't shake that feeling. Whoever it was, they were watching, waiting, testing my tent like they'd done it before, like they were used to people breaking when they were scared enough. I never told anyone, not my brother, not my friends. Felt too strange, too unreal, but I still camp, just not alone, and not anywhere near Arkansas. I was 28 years old when I did something I now realize was one of the dumbest ideas I've ever followed through on. I had just left a logistics job in Chicago and was in that restless space where you feel like doing something spontaneous to shake the dust off your life. I had a couple of weeks before I started a new role down in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I decided to take a solo road trip. I packed up my used 2012 Subaru Forester, tossed in a cheap tent, a camping stove, a sleeping bag, and the rest of the gear I'd used in the past for weekend hikes. I figured I'd hit a few state parks, maybe stop by some small towns I'd never heard of. No real plan, just go where the road led me. A few days into the drive, I ended up in rural Missouri. I'd pulled off Interstate 44 and followed some winding county roads into a tiny place called Hartlow. Barely a blip on the map. The town looked like it had seen better days. Most of the storefronts on Main Street were shuttered, and even the gas station looked like it was on its last leg. I stopped there to fill up and grab some snacks. The older woman at the register glanced at my backpack and asked if I was headed out to the lake. I said I was just passing through, maybe camping for a night. She didn't say anything after that, just rang me up with this kind of flat expression. While munching on trail mix in the car, I pulled out my phone and started looking at satellite maps. The official campgrounds in the area didn't appeal to me. Too close to roads, too groomed. I liked seclusion, something quiet where I could fall asleep to the sounds of nature and wake up with morning fog rolling across the ground. I zoomed out and noticed a large patch of green to the northeast of town. There were no markers for hiking trails or park signs, just raw woods and open fields. It was bordered on the south side by a long, narrow graveyard called Ashford Cemetery. I'd never camped near a graveyard before, but the thought didn't bother me. In fact, I figured it was the kind of place no one else would bother going to, especially at night. That's what I was after, complete solitude. I drove about 25 minutes along cracked, narrowing country roads. The GPS lost signal eventually, but I followed an old gravel path leading toward the cemetery. It wasn't maintained. Grass and weeds pushed up through the center of the road, and branches hung low enough to scrape across my windshield. After another half mile, the trees opened up to a clearing with a rusted iron gate. Beyond it, I could see rows of headstones spread across a gentle hill. There wasn't a soul around. I parked the car just off the gravel, close enough to back out easily, but out of view from the road. Not that I'd seen another car in nearly an hour. I grabbed my pack, slung it over one shoulder, and stepped over the gate, which had no lock, just a chain looped through. The hinges had rusted solid. Ashford Cemetery was old, really old. Many of the stones had cracked or fallen, with names worn nearly flat by time and weather. The air was still, no wind, just the occasional chirp of a bird far off or the ticking noise of insects in the grass. I walked around the perimeter until I found a small wooded stretch behind the far corner of the cemetery. The trees there were thick enough to offer cover but spaced out enough that I could pitch my tent without a problem. I set up camp about 40 feet into the trees. From there, I could still see the cemetery's edge, but it felt distant. The ground was soft with dead leaves, and the canopy above filtered out most of the sunlight. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside the tent, got my mini propane stove going, and made a cup of coffee while heating up some canned stew. I sat there on a fold-out stool, sipping the coffee, listening to the dull quiet of the forest. I remember thinking it was exactly what I needed. No emails, no traffic, no office lights, just trees, earth, and sky. The sun dropped quicker than I expected. It was only about 6:30 p.m., but the woods went dark fast. I turned on my headlamp and walked back to the edge of the cemetery. There was a kind of strange peace to it. Just me, the wind brushing faintly through the grass, and rows of weather-beaten stones. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, just observing, not really thinking much. Then I heard something. It was faint, like a rustling. I spun around, half expecting to see a deer or raccoon, but the woods behind me were still. The noise had been light, too light to be a person walking, but too distinct to be the wind. I stepped back toward the tent and stood still for a long minute, listening. Nothing. My mind started playing the usual tricks. Maybe a squirrel on a branch, maybe my own boot catching something I didn't notice. I went back to my tent and zipped it closed, ate the rest of my stew cold, and read a book by flashlight. Eventually, I drifted off around 9:30 p.m. I woke up to the sound of something hitting metal. It was subtle, like a dull clang or a rattle. I stayed completely still, every muscle tensed. I turned off my flashlight and listened in the dark. My heart thudded harder with each second. The noise came again. A quick tap, like something brushing or striking the iron gate I had stepped over earlier. I slid silently out of my sleeping bag and pulled the zipper just enough to peek outside. My eyes were adjusting to the dark. I didn't use the flashlight. If there was someone out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake. Then I saw it. About 30 yards away, near the gate, a small pinprick of light moved slowly, side to side, like someone holding a flashlight and scanning the area. But the light wasn't strong. It flickered, dim and low. It wasn't from a modern flashlight. It looked like it could have been a phone screen or even a small candle. It moved closer to the gate, then disappeared for a few seconds. I barely breathed. Then I heard footsteps, one, maybe two sets, soft but distinct, grass flattening under deliberate weight. They weren't rushing or staggering like someone drunk or lost. These were calm, patient steps. I was frozen. I didn't know if I should grab my knife, my car keys, or just stay still. I knew I couldn't risk unzipping the tent any further without making noise. I sat there, barely breathing, and waited. The footsteps circled. I could hear them moving from the gate toward the tree line. Not directly toward me, but wide, like they were sweeping around the edge. Every few minutes, they'd stop, then pick up again, crunching dry leaves or breaking a twig. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted to be heard. It went on for almost an hour. Then, nothing. Silence returned. I stayed awake until morning. When light finally pushed through the trees, I packed up fast. I didn't eat, didn't even brush my teeth. I just shoved everything into the pack and hiked back to the car. But something stopped me. Near the gate, where I had crossed the day before, I saw a fresh footprint in the dirt. Not a boot tread, just a single barefoot print. Deep, clean, like someone had stood there a long while. And next to it, there was something else, half buried in the grass. A rusty tin can, the kind you'd see used to hold old nails or screws. Inside it were cigarette butts. Some of them looked fresh. I got in the car, locked the doors, and drove out without stopping until I hit the interstate. I didn't file a report. What would I even say? Someone walked near my tent? It wasn't illegal to be in the cemetery. But the way they moved, the way they circled, silent and patient, it wasn't normal. It wasn't right. A few weeks later, I looked up Hartlow and Ashford Cemetery online. There wasn't much about either. But I did find a few forum threads from nearly a decade ago, hikers and explorers posting about abandoned sites. One thread mentioned Ashford. A user named TR77 wrote that he'd seen signs of squatting there, and that locals warned him about people who camp there that never leave. I don't know who was out there that night. Maybe a drifter. Maybe someone using the woods to hide from something. But I do know this, when I left, I didn't feel like I was just walking away from a creepy night. I felt like I had barely escaped something worse. and I haven't camped alone since. I was 31 when I decided to take a break from the city for a few days. It was 2019, and I had been working 12-hour shifts at a warehouse in Jacksonville, Florida. I'd saved up enough to take a week off and figured I'd drive north to get some real solitude. Maybe do some hiking and camping in Georgia. I'd always been drawn to the woods. I liked the quiet, the smell of pine and earth, the way time slows down when you're away from cars and phones and crowds. I picked a place I found online, Black Oak Forest. It was one of those spots you don't hear much about, kind of wedged between two state parks, but not exactly a park itself. Just old timberland and forgotten trails, with a handful of campsites that hadn't been used in a while. The spot was about a 5-hour drive from home. I packed up my old Toyota Tacoma with a tent, sleeping bag, a cooler of food, and basic supplies: matches, flashlight, pocket knife, some rope, a water purifier, and a basic med kit. I got to the area late in the afternoon and drove about 6 miles down a gravel road past the last sign of civilization. A rusty little gas station with no one inside and a back in 10 minutes sign that looked like it had been there for days. Once the road ended, I parked and hiked another mile in with my gear to the campsite I picked. It was a flat clearing surrounded by trees that looked like they'd been standing 100 years. The only sign of recent human activity was a rusted fire ring and a broken folding chair slumped against a log. I liked that. It felt untouched. I set up camp, took my time getting things in order, staked down the tent, unpacked my cooler, and gathered some dead branches for a fire. I didn't plan to do anything fancy, just sit, eat, relax, and maybe hike deeper in the next morning. It was late September, and the air had that perfect early autumn coolness. I roasted a few hot dogs over the fire and drank a beer from the cooler. No phone signal, no noise except crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Just me and the woods. I felt calm. I turned in around 10, climbed into my sleeping bag, and laid there listening to the wind outside. The tent walls flapped softly, and a few times I thought I heard footsteps, just faint crunches of twigs and leaves. But that's normal. Animals move at night. Deer, raccoons, squirrels, all that. I told myself it was nothing and eventually drifted off. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to a sound that snapped me fully awake. It wasn't a normal forest sound. It was a sharp, metallic clinking. Not loud, but close, like someone tapping a small piece of metal against another, slowly and deliberately. Then it stopped. I waited, holding my breath, every nerve awake. For about a minute, there was nothing. Then I heard a quiet grunt, like someone clearing their throat. Human. I stayed completely still. My heart was pounding, and I could feel sweat on my back even though the air was cool. I slowly reached to my side and grabbed my flashlight, careful not to make a sound. I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out. My fire had burned down to a faint glow, and beyond that was nothing but dark shapes of trees. But then, just barely visible, maybe 15 feet away, someone was crouched behind a tree. I could just make out a shoulder, the curve of a head. They weren't moving, just watching. I don't know how long they'd been there. Maybe hours. Maybe since I first started setting up. I didn't shine the light. I didn't move. I eased the zipper back down and stayed still for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the crunch of leaves started again, moving away this time and fading into the forest. I waited until the sun rose before I unzipped the tent again. When I stepped out, everything looked normal. The woods were quiet, peaceful, but something was off. A small detail that made the hairs on my arms stand up. One of my hiking boots was moved. Not far, just turned slightly and shifted a few feet to the left. I never leave my stuff like that. Someone had been right there, right outside the tent while I slept. I packed up right then, threw everything into my backpack and collapsed the tent in minutes. I didn't even bother to eat. I wanted to be gone. I started back on the trail fast, trying not to break into a full sprint. It was just past 7 a.m. The trees were letting in light, and I kept checking over my shoulder every couple of steps. Then, about halfway back to my truck, I noticed something else that didn't sit right. A small pile of pebbles on the side of the trail, neatly stacked for stones high. Nothing dramatic, but definitely placed by hand. A little farther up, another stack, then another, every 30 yards or so. I hadn't seen them on the way in. Someone had made them overnight, maybe to mark something, maybe just to mess with me. I didn't stop to study them. I just kept moving. My truck came into view and I damn near jogged the last stretch. When I got in and locked the doors, I sat for a minute just breathing. My mouth was dry and my hands were shaking. The gas gauge was half full and I didn't care about the rest of the food or gear. I just wanted out. The drive back felt longer. Every car I passed, every person I saw on the side of the road, I wondered if they had followed me. I didn't stop until I hit a busy gas station an hour outside the forest. I filled up, bought a coffee, and sat in the lot with the engine running. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? Someone stood near my tent and didn't do anything? There was no crime, no evidence, just weirdness. I never went back to Black Oak Forest. I looked it up again later that week, and it barely existed on any official maps. No rangers,
No oversight.
just public land and long-forgotten paths. I don't think I'll ever know who that was or what they wanted. Maybe they were just a drifter. Maybe they were planning to do something worse and changed their mind. Or maybe they were just watching, for hours, silently. That experience changed the way I think about being alone in the woods. Before, it felt like freedom. Now it feels like vulnerability. I still go camping, but never solo anymore. I always tell someone where I'm going. I keep a satellite tracker, and I carry more than just a pocket knife. Because sometimes it's not the animals you should worry about. It's the people who don't want to be seen. The ones who wait, silent and still, just beyond the firelight. I was 36 the summer I went camping alone in northern Arkansas. It was late July 2017, and I'd just gotten out of a messy breakup. I needed space, and I didn't want to talk to anyone. I'd been staying with a buddy for a few weeks, sleeping on a lumpy couch that made my back hurt every morning. I didn't have a job lined up, and honestly, I wasn't trying that hard to find one. I just wanted to disappear for a while. I found a spot online, Ozark National Forest. The pictures looked nice. Woods that stretched on forever, steep hills, clear streams. A few campgrounds, but also large areas of backcountry where I could set up my tent far away from anyone else. That's exactly what I wanted. No noise, no people, no questions. Just trees and quiet. I packed light. One of those big internal frame backpacks, a tent, sleeping bag, food for a week, water filter, a small gas stove, basic gear. I brought a small pistol too, a Glock 19. I wasn't planning on using it, but I didn't feel comfortable going that deep into the woods alone without some kind of protection. I also had a folding knife and a headlamp with spare batteries. I'd done enough camping over the years to know how to prepare. The drive took almost 5 hours from Little Rock. Once I got off the highway, the road twisted through dense green hills. The last bit was a gravel forest road that climbed slowly into the mountains. I stopped at a ranger station, filled out a backcountry permit, told them roughly where I was heading, and signed my name. The ranger at the desk barely looked up. I left my truck at a pull-off near a marked trailhead, grabbed my pack, and started walking. I followed a trail for maybe 4 miles, then veered off into the woods. I wasn't using GPS, just a topographic map and compass. I found a small ridge with a flat area on top and set up camp. The trees were thick, mostly oak and hickory, and there was a little spring-fed stream about 200 yards downhill. I spent the first day setting up, gathering firewood, filtering water, and just listening to the silence. Birds, wind in the leaves, occasional squirrel rustling around. Felt good to be away from everything. The second day, I hiked further in and tried to mark trees with small strips of orange tape so I wouldn't get lost. The forest looked the same in every direction, and without a trail it was easy to get turned around. I climbed a small bluff and sat up there for a while, looking out across the trees. Miles and miles of untouched woods. I didn't see a single person. That's what I wanted. But that night, something felt off. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint snapping sound outside the tent. Not an animal rustling. This was more deliberate, slow, spaced out, like someone stepping on dry twigs, pausing, then stepping again. I froze. My heart started thumping. I listened hard. After a few seconds, I heard it again. Crack, crack, then silence. I slowly reached for the pistol in my bag and sat there, not moving, barely breathing. I didn't open the tent. I didn't shine my light. I just waited. Eventually the sound faded, but I couldn't sleep after that. I kept replaying it in my head. I tried to convince myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, but it didn't sound like that. The next morning, I looked around the campsite. I didn't see any tracks, just my own boot prints and flattened grass where I'd walked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby. I decided to move camp deeper into the forest, just in case. I packed up and hiked for most of the day, going uphill and then dropping down into a small hollow. I didn't use my orange markers this time. I didn't want anyone following them. I set up in a new spot, this time beside a small creek under a stand of pine. I made sure my camp was well hidden. No tarp, no bright colors, and I kept the fire small that night. I didn't cook anything, just ate jerky and trail mix. As it got dark, I loaded the pistol and kept it next to my sleeping bag. That night, nothing happened. I fell asleep and stayed asleep. When I woke up, it was mid-morning and the sun was coming through the trees. I felt better. Maybe I'd imagined the sounds. Maybe it was just the stress messing with me. I spent the day fishing at the creek, even though I hadn't brought much fishing gear. I tied some line to a stick and used a safety pin for a hook. Caught a few little fish and let them go. I saw deer tracks near the bank and a couple of frogs sunning themselves on a rock. It was peaceful. I didn't hear any voices, no engines, no music, just nature. But later that afternoon, while I was gathering firewood, I found something that made my stomach sink. About 50 yards from my tent, I saw a tree that had been recently marked. A deep slash, chest high, fresh bark peeled away. I didn't do that. It wasn't from an animal. It looked like someone had dragged a knife or hatchet across the trunk. I looked around. Another tree about 20 feet away had the same kind of cut, and another after that. They were in a line, not random. Someone had made a trail marker. I followed the slashes for a few minutes. They led up the ridge behind my camp. About a quarter mile up, I found an old tarp tied between two trees. Under it were empty cans, torn food wrappers, and a pile of ashes from a fire that had burned not long ago. There were boot prints in the dirt, bigger than mine. This wasn't some old hunter's site. It looked recent. Someone had been living there. I backed out slowly and didn't touch anything. When I got back to camp, I packed up again. My arms were shaking and my shirt was soaked with sweat even though it wasn't that hot. I didn't know what I was dealing with, maybe just a drifter, maybe something worse. I didn't want to wait around to find out. I hiked for hours. I didn't follow any trail. I just moved as fast as I could through the underbrush, heading northeast toward a Forest Service road I remembered seeing on the map. My legs burned and my shoulders ached. I stopped only to drink water. Around dusk, I found a flat area near a boulder and set up a cold camp. No fire, no light, just rolled out the bag and lay down. couldn't sleep. Every sound made me flinch. I kept imagining someone watching me from the trees. I held the pistol in my hand and stared up at the black sky through the branches. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to a sound like something being dropped onto the forest floor. Not close, just enough to snap me out of sleep. I stayed still and listened. Then I heard a twig snap. Then another. Closer. I sat up, heart pounding, and aimed the gun toward the sound. I didn't yell. I didn't move. The sound stopped. I sat like that for maybe half an hour, hand cramping around the grip of the pistol. Eventually, the forest was silent again. When the sky turned gray with morning, I got up and started walking. I didn't eat. I didn't even roll up the sleeping bag, just shoved it into my pack and left. I kept moving all day, checking my compass every few minutes. Around noon, I finally saw tire tracks, deep ruts in the mud heading down a slope. I followed them, hoping they'd lead to a service road. They did. 2 miles later, I came out onto a gravel road. No traffic, but at least it was something. I sat on the edge, completely drained. My clothes were soaked with sweat, my boots were cutting into my ankles, and my head was pounding. I walked that road for nearly 3 more hours before I heard an engine. A dusty pickup rounded the bend, and I stepped out, waving both arms. The driver, a guy in his 60s with a flannel shirt and a long white beard, slowed down, rolled down the window, and looked at me like I just crawled out of a hole. I asked if he could take me to the nearest ranger station. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded and opened the door. At the station, I told them what happened. I left out the part about the gun. I just said I thought someone had been stalking me in the woods, and that I'd found a camp that looked abandoned but not very old. The ranger asked me to point it out on the map, which I did. He said he'd send someone to check it out. I didn't stick around. I thanked the driver again, bought a soda from a vending machine, and waited until the ranger called a tow company to help me get back to my truck. When I got back to the truck, it was untouched. No one had slashed the tires or broken the windows. Nothing was missing. I drove straight home. I didn't go back into the woods for a long time after that, not even to camp at a state park. I started locking my doors at night again, even when it was 90 degrees out. For weeks, I kept checking the backyard before going to bed. I never found out who that person was or what they were doing out there. Maybe just someone who wanted to be left alone. Maybe someone worse. But what scared me most wasn't what I saw. It was what I didn't see. The silence, the waiting, the not knowing. There was no big confrontation, no fight.
No screaming.
Just slow footsteps in the dark and the feeling of being watched. And in the end, that was enough. It made me realize how small I was out there, how easy it would have been for someone to just wait for the right moment, how long they might have been watching without me knowing. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I hear a noise in the woods or see tree markings on a hike. I wonder how close I came to disappearing without a trace. But I didn't. I made it out. I went in looking for quiet. I found something else entirely.